Welcome and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Together with our partners at Oxford Net Zero, the Resilient 40 Network, and our young climate and resilient leaders who are setting the agenda today, we are very delighted to have you with us. We'll spend some time today summarizing the key takeaways from the Youth Setting the Agenda dialogues that have taken place over the last fortnight. And we'll present an outline of how the youth and the climate champions will follow up with commitments and actions proposed with industry leaders during the dialogues. My name is Shivi, and I work with the People Engagement Strategy team within the high-level Climate Champions team. It's a privilege. Earlier this year, I came across a stat that was very hard for me to ignore. 4 in every 10 people, which is almost 42% of the global population, is under the age of 25. And millennials, who form a big part of this population, in a survey conducted by World Economic Forum, said that they believe that climate change and conflict are the most critical issues that the world is facing today. While it's evident that the youth of today are going to be facing the remnants and the actions of other generations, young people feel that the voices are not being heard, at least not enough. Living in a lockdown for more than 6 months this year has made it very clear that whether it's the threat of a pandemic or climate change, you and I, our planet, we will not be able to survive the aftermath unless we act now. And not just act as individuals, but act collectively and inclusively. As I imagine a 15-year-old Greta missing school to sit alone and protest outside the Swedish parliament, it gives me goosebumps because I didn't have the courage to do something like that. However, it's her grit and feistiness which has given so many young people around the world the inspiration and hope to define and organize their own climate ambition and their action plans. While the global north saw the youth organize and campaign via school strikes and rallies, the global south reacted a bit differently. In the words of Nisreen, who's here with us today, she said that in a country like Sudan, where going to school is a privilege for a lot of students, it didn't make sense for people to strike, to stay out of school they struggled so hard to get access to. Young people in Sudan and countries like mine in India instead took to policy, activism, advocacy, and getting involved in community-based work around climate change. As developing countries like mine, India, are constantly working on improving their basic infrastructure, be it transport, be it power supply, we're finding more and more that the youth are constantly in conflict with the government and businesses about finding a balance between development and regenerative development. And honestly, there are a lot of people who don't really even understand what regenerative development is. Last year itself, India saw young people marching, protesting, campaigning, and forming human chains to save the cutting down of almost 3,000 trees in the heart of such a busy city like Mumbai. These trees were proposed to cut down to make way for a metro shed. And it's worth noting that a metropolitan city like Bombay, with a population of over 20 million, received its first metro line just 6 years ago in 2014. And that was a big reason why there was such a section and just a small age group of people who had climate on their mind. And there were a lot of people who were just kind of waiting for this to take place. The youth protest not just put a stay on cutting down the trees, but also one in recognizing 800 acres of that land in the middle of a city like Bombay as a forest reserve. That was a big win for us. And more recently, just a couple of weeks ago, amidst the lockdown, the youth have been raising the voice via social media campaigns and organizing tweet storms, something we'd never heard before, to protect a national park in Goa from 3 major infrastructure development projects. Sanctioning these projects would result in cutting down of almost 60,000 trees, which would not just affect the livelihood, but also just, can you imagine the loss of wildlife when you cut down so many trees? Through these examples, it's just clear that the last 5 years since the signing of the Paris Agreement, the youth around the world have continued to find their own voice. Last week itself, and I know Nigel was a part of that session, UK schools hosted the Youth Climate Summit. Together with votes of thousands of school-going children, the schools agreed on a 5-point agenda for the government and businesses, which would be taken forward by Mock COP and the Sustainable Innovation Forum. The agenda included asking all schools to be carbon neutral and support existing schools to turn carbon neutral by 2030. And just starting at the 19th of this month, we have Pope Francis, who is convening 1,000 young entrepreneurs and economists to build a more sustainable and equitable and a people-oriented economy. So we can now no longer underestimate the commitment of young people to battle climate change. And that's what we're here to talk about. Today, we have with us two young speakers, Kaya and Nasike, who would be summarizing the youth dialogues, which took place, as I mentioned, over the last fortnight. And we'll be presenting it to Nisreen Elsaim, who's the chairperson of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, and incredibly inspiring high-level climate champions, Gonzalo Munoz and Nigel Topping. With this, I hand over to our first speaker, Kaya, who is a policy engagement fellow at Oxford University's new research program called Oxford Net Zero, and has been the convener and the driving force behind the Youth Setting the Agenda series. Kaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shivi. And I have to say that you don't give yourself enough credit if you hand it over to me, as you have been the convening magic behind these dialogues and making sure our audience is prepared and excited. So thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to work with you. And I believe my job in this segment today is to reflect with our champions. Thank you so much for being here, Nigel and Gonzalo, on a topic close to my heart and my focus of study, which is our energy transition as it relates to our transport system as well. So a few years ago, I did my master's thesis on unusual political coalitions brought about through conscious dialogue that have helped to bring about major leaps in the market expansion of renewable energy solutions. I was looking at coalitions like the Tea Party in the US working with Greenpeace to pass market expansion policies in the state of Georgia, a key state at the moment for coalition building in the US, where I'm from. But in a way, last week's dialogue was a bit of an unusual coalition experiment, given that I have in the past been someone who camped outside of the headquarters of Shell refineries. And here I was inviting to a dialogue, you know, the chief of strategy for Shell and BP, Daimler, Mercedes, Kuehne+Nagel, and the International Airline Group. So it was just really incredible to see when you bring people together from like supposedly opposite sides of the battle, you see how much there are people working on all sides of and from all positions to facilitate a faster energy and transport transition. And I really have to give kudos to our high-level champions for setting us this challenge to come together because we can't waste any time. And I also have to share my earned respect for our deeply thoughtful speakers, our youth speakers who didn't let the industry leaders off the hook at any point during the dialogue, and our industry speakers who showed up with openness and finesse in these conversations. So if you'll allow me, I'd like to just paint a picture for you by telling you a little bit about a couple of these moments before we reflect on what we have to do next, because that's really the point. I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but Eva Grenier, who spoke to us representing Mercedes-Benz and Daimler, shared with me ahead of the panel that she was a little bit nervous because she's not a public speaker, she's a chief engineer. And she doesn't like to do these kinds of things. She's sort of a modest leader. But for context, she's leading on the company's electric vehicle system. And she's also, you know, despite her claims that she was not a good public speaker, she was one of our best speakers because she showed up with concise, clear, honest responses to the questions. And she took in feedback really honestly, and in only the way that like someone who is constantly working to improve a vehicle and improve a system would take back feedback, because you know feedback is the point. So I wanted to highlight some of the questions that she was asked and the ways that she responded based on where her company is going, and as well as the ambition that I think we're going to see around this this company and this whole sector as it enters the new paradigm. So in particular, Eva was asked by one of our incredible youth speakers, Simonetta Spavieri, who's a responsible investment analyst, so she's very used to engaging with companies. Eva was asked specifically when the company would transition away from combustion engine vehicles. And what she said was they have a target by 2039 to have net zero vehicles, but that they couldn't necessarily commit to a date at which they would phase out completely out of combustion engine vehicles. And this is where I thought our high-level champion played the role of championing ambition and jumping in. And Nigel, thank you so much for reminding everyone that, the government, maybe you had a tip off from number 10, but the governments around the world are moving faster than that. And so companies that want to be seen as leading need to also stay ahead of the law on moving out of combustion engine vehicles. Daimler also, said that their strategy is by 2025 to aim for a 25% of their sales to be electric and trucks to hydrogen, which is, I think, going to take on quite a lot of the innovation that we need in the sector and pilot it and show other companies that we can do that. And then she said that they would phase out in stages, but she also said she was really touched by the session and it really seemed honest, and she would go away and think about it more. So I think we'll follow up with her on that. And again, we were just so pleased to have her on the panel. A couple of other quick highlights. Our youth asked Alan Haywood, strategy lead at BP, and Malika Ishwaran, strategy lead at Shell, when will they stop all oil exploration activity? And BP said that they've committed to stop exploring outside of their current provinces, which I'd like to look into more what current provinces means, but that they're still investing something like 800 million in exploration, which is, I guess, a substantial reduction on previous years. But youth in the dialogue followed up mentioning that the carbon bubble, our existing carbon budget left in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, suggests that the new assets that they're exploring for may not be burnable, and that we need to look into that. Now, they spoke honestly about some constraints that they have with that, right? Shell and BP are in a hard place if they want to stop exploring due to what they said are competitiveness issues, to which we posed the follow-up question, how would they help us convene other players in their sector so that we can be acting together? And so that some of those competitive first mover issues that they talked about could be overcome, because they're very right. It can't just be, two top publicly traded companies. We have to bring the whole sector along, including our national oil and gas companies. Alan from BP was also really open enough to share with us how personal this is for him, talking about how his 13-year-old son, youth sets the agenda, asked him every day for 2 weeks what he was doing for the energy transition, showing once again how young people are keeping the discussion framed all over the world. And Malika and Alan stayed on with us for over an hour after the discussion in private, just discussing what can we do, what are the policy mechanisms that can help enable a faster transition. So next time, I think it's important that we bring policymakers to the table so no one can play hot potato, because it's never someone else's problem, it's all of our problem, and we can claim it together. So these were just a couple of the most important moments from the Youth, Energy, and Transport dialogue. And usually these panels run a really high risk of being performative and tokenistic. And no matter how honest or productive it was, and was in this case, our youth have spent so much time convening and curating a message, and we have activists all over the world, youth laying their lives down for this effort, and we can't forget that. And so what we have to do is, deeply reflect on what we've learned, come back together and follow up with these companies, engage more companies, especially those that haven't set net zero targets. Because let's be honest, we started with the leaders, which is a relative position, but all the same. So tactically speaking, of course, we have to do more than panels. We have to think strategically. I mean, as an activist, you don't just use one tactic because the police come and they put you in jail and then you have to try a new one. And so I think we, as activists in suits today, have to be tactically fluid as well. And I think we have an opportunity to speak more about that. But Nigel, this is the moment where I wanted to turn it over to you. You were on the panel. You were so helpful. You really amplified the youth's voices and our perspectives and came in with a lot of inspiring statistics on the pace of change and inspiring companies to follow. what should we do next? And what was your perspective and reflections from the panel?
Well, first of all, I was thrilled with the panel, and congratulations to to Oxford Net Zero and the Resilient 40, and CV. Thanks for your help because this is hard, right? Because what we're trying to do is I mean, one of the things that I don't know if I've got it in front of me, but I've read it 1,000 times. Bill Sharp wrote this wonderful book called Three Horizons. It's about how to think about the future, but the subtitle, I'm looking for it, it's somewhere amongst all these millions of books I've got here. The subtitle is oh, here it is. Let me just show. It's just a little book, right? So it's worth reading. It's Three Horizons. It's about how to think about the future, and the subtitle is The Patterning of Hope. And what Bill's taught me is that life is all about patterns, and sometimes we get stuck in bad patterns. As an individual, we call it a bad habit, right? Drinking too much, eating the wrong food, not exercising enough. But we also have societal habits or societal patterns, like being addicted to fossil fuels is one that, I mean, a century ago it felt like a miracle, like cheap energy that can free the world, right? And then we've come to realize that it's an addiction that's killing us, killing the world. So I think one thing that you did a great job is setting a tone where we can have respectful dialogue, because I often think most people who went into an oil company 30 years ago were young geologists who wanted to do a kind of meaningful, interesting job, travel the world, right? They didn't join, and those are the people we were talking to. So first of all, I want to say thank you for creating a space of respect where we could have really difficult conversations, and not just fall into polarization and finger pointing. But I think it's important to say that having a respectful, calm conversation isn't the same as being naive or colluding, right? You don't have to agree. You can, we have to be able to hold strongly opposing views, but still listen. And I thought the questions were great. And actually, sometimes when people talk about youth voice, they think about teenagers, right, who have a really important voice, right? And they are, and you're right, I went to the Youth Climate Summit and there were teenagers and there were 6-year-olds, right, who have a really important voice, and it's a different kind of voice, right? The 6-year-old is kind of emotional. You're like, oh my god, that 6-year-old is really, are we leaving a world to that 6-year-old that's as bad as they've just realized it could be? I feel bad about that. But then the 14-year-old is kind of the slightly feisty, activist who's like studying science and is starting to have some really good pointed questions. But what I really liked was the young professionals. It's like, okay, this is toe to toe, right? There's no, the young professional might not know as much as the chief engineer of eDrive at Mercedes about electric motors, but they know a lot. And there was young professionals who knew all about sustainable aviation fuels and carbon capture and storage. So I think that's that bringing that kind of smarts, sort of young, challenging smarts into the room was really helpful. I really agree with you that that's what we've tried to do with these whole dialogues, right? It's create space. Some people say, why isn't it all about action? I'm like, well, before you act, you got to think. And if your thinking is flawed, then you better take some time out to rethink. And a good way to rethink is to spend some time listening to each other and listening to different perspectives. And it also makes the activists better, right? If you understand maybe there's a real reason why that young engineer in Daimler or that older strategist in Shell is constrained. Maybe that makes you a better campaigner. Maybe find a counter argument, because maybe it's a weak argument, or maybe you find another way around it. So I would really encourage you to take these further, and I'm sure Gonzalo would agree. We would love to work with you, and I think get policymakers in the room as well, and get more granular. I think so you could spend 2 hours just on, and you can also have some of the sort of campaign, like Sapura Berman, who's a brilliant environmental activist who's working right now on something she calls the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So you think about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So she's thinking really big about what might one day be an international agreement. So I think, for me, these were really successful. There was no sense of finger pointing or ad hominem attacks, like who which I think is important. But there was smart, challenging conversation, and I'm really thrilled. I didn't know until you told me that the conversation went on for an hour afterwards. I think also sometimes, I mean, look, there are crooks, there are evil people somewhere in every aspect of society, right? In the church, in politics, in academia, in business, in investment. There is evil, there are bad people, but most people are humans who just want to be part of something that's positive and who want to be recognized. That people don't get up every morning and decide to try to make things terrible for the next generation. They get stuck in these patterns. So I think these respectful but challenging dialogues is a really good way of unsticking some patterns and giving people some freedom to move into new patterns. So I thought it was great, and I want to see more of it.
Thanks so much, Nigel. And I'm sure we will see more of it. We'll make more of it. So our next segment,
sorry, Kaya, I'll say that. So I've got to do some closing remarks. I'll save that. Carry on.
We're bringing you back. Don't worry, we've got more time on these ones. We don't have quite as many packed panelists. So in the next section, we've got Nasike. Nasike Akalo Claire is a Kenyan agroecologist and a food campaigner at Greenpeace Africa. She's also a Wangari Maathai Scholarship Awardee and a member of the Resilient 40 Network. And Nasike has dedicated her life to restoring nature and through agriculture. So we're so delighted to have her reflections today on that session and what she thought.
Thank you so much, Kaya. I am indeed delighted to share with you some of the key takeaways and learnings and personal reflections from the session on youth setting the agenda on the future of food and agriculture in the Rest to Zero dialogues that happened yesterday. And these were dialogue sessions with the industry leaders. Questions were posed yesterday by some of the youth to these industry leaders. Like some of the questions were like, how can this food industry leaders take on and help to scale more climate conscious young industry entrepreneurs whose models to support regenerative agriculture? And there's also a question on how can major food distributors better reflect on the shifting diets of young people to eat within our planetary boundaries and shift towards more plant-based and low carbon intensive diets. There's also a question on from soil to plate. So how are these companies contributing to building a sustainable net zero food system to ensure that we young people don't fit the bill for shocks to the system later? So from that engagement, I had a few key takeaways, and one of them was I have grouped them into categories, and I'd like to begin with land stewardship. Most of the companies spoke about their involvement in land. They spoke about regenerative agriculture, but there was no clear program about them supporting regenerative agriculture. Like it was not very clear. They say companies like Tisco and Nestle, they told us about their various programs to support entrepreneurs, programs to support women, including some work with smallholder, tackling employment and livelihoods. But they were just described as an assortment of projects rather than core business. And we didn't get to hear a great deal about what they were doing, which was specific to regenerative agriculture. We're talking about ecological farming, we're talking about organic farming, and just generally also climate mitigation work. I personally didn't hear that. Additionally, there was also the lack of clarity. Supermarkets, and this particularly goes to Tesco. Yes, they spoke about creating partnerships with organizations such as WWF to scale and standardize how food companies in the UK can embed regenerative practices. But I think under this section, I was looking at hearing how these farming practices, which cared for the soil in ecological and non-chemical ways, I was also looking to hear about how these companies are supporting smallholder farmers that carry out regenerative agriculture. We have farmers who grow food that is grown in a safe and sustainable way. So how are these supermarkets supporting such kind of farmers? Are they buying produce that has been sustainably produced, or are they working with organizations that train farmers on regenerative agriculture? I didn't hear none of that. And then on accountability, it was quite evident that some of these companies are ambitious about setting zero emission targets through, of course, their operations and products, but there was a lack of clear accountability and procedure of how they are going to achieve those targets. And there was little to no accountability, particularly in the supply chains for the big players in the food industry. For example, Nestle, as looking at hearing them say, like, they guarantee that their sourced cocoa is not associated with child labor, something that they have been accused of before and which is actually unsustainable. Although we did hear that Nestle will be announcing a net zero carbon plans early next year, we will be interested to take a look at this, like including their roadmap for engaging more directly with agriculture. And I am hoping that we can explore the details of their ambitious plans, particularly in this sector. And under accountability as well, I think underlying this is the really important question of accountability in this vast supply chains. These companies represent huge systems they are embarking and reaching. For example, Coca-Cola, tens of thousands of farmers in India, and this also applies to Nestle, which is working with a number of farmers. All this is a good thing, but I'd like to get a better idea of the solid targets and the statistics about the scale of their commitment. What proportion of their supply chain are they working with? And in what ways will this help to mitigate climate change? And again, as we look at climate change and the mitigation of its impacts, the metrics overall across agriculture and lands. So these companies like Nestle, Coca-Cola, what proportion of land are they responsible for? What are their contributions to the reduction in the greenhouse gases, which we need to secure for this planet? On shifting diets, this goes to Tesco. And I think Tesco as a supermarket, from what the representatives said, they're putting in little effort to educate consumers, particularly on the effects of their consumption patterns. I got the feeling that it's all about profit for them and not offering sustainably sourced products or sustainably produced food products. There's particularly a question of the role of this a question on the role these supermarkets could play in shifting diets. And the Tesco representative said that you cannot force consumers to buy a certain product. And she further added that you have to be creative to do that. We didn't hear a clear commitment on the supply side change, apart from that partnership that she spoke of with WWF on reforestation. So it would have been good to hear what Tesco is doing in regards to shifting diets, changing consumption patterns. On cost of investment in the global south, I think most of the company representatives that spoke, there was a lack of clarity on how the big industry players like Nestle are keen to scale up the regenerative efforts, particularly those of young agriculturalists from the global south. Well, besides empowering 5 million women farmers by 2020, I didn't get any clear commitment from Coca-Cola, particularly on the depletion of water resources. This is something that they have been accused of, considering that water is their primary ingredient in virtually every Coca-Cola product. So I was looking forward to hearing more of that, but there wasn't any. And onto my personal reflection, like what I thought of the section, aside from these key takeaways. My day-to-day job at Greenpeace Africa entails working with smallholder farmers on ecological farming and building sustainable food systems that help these farmers adapt to the impacts of climate change. And aside from that, protecting the natural resource base, which we know that is quite important in food production. So I was rather disappointed by the lack of the clear commitments from some of the big players in the food industry, as some of them have been in the spotlight for overexploitation of natural resources. For instance, it was not clear how supermarkets such as Tesco are keen to support local farmers practicing regenerative agriculture. So if these companies can make it their priority to buy food, or these supermarkets rather, can make it their priority to buy food that has been sustainably produced by the farmers, then I think, having worked with farmers, the farmers will have no choice but to grow their food in a sustainable way, because there's already a present market for such kind of produce and they do not want to lose that market. So what do they have to do? Grow food in a sustainable manner to make sure that they keep the market that they already have access to. My other take on this, or personal reflection on shifting to plant-based diets, I feel like this is likely to create pressure on the available natural resources. So every individual is keen to move to plant-based diets. This pressure on the natural and available natural resources actually differs very minimally from that created by the meat and dairy industry. So if we are to shift to plant-based diet and promote this kind of diets, then we have to ensure that our forests are not cleared to pave way for avocado plantations, for instance, or local communities are not displaced from their habitats to pave way for palm oil plantations. Aside from that, I got the feeling that supermarkets are keen on making profit at the expense of our environment. So statements from Tesco, such as, "You cannot force customers to buy a certain product." This statement proves that these supermarkets can source and stock products that have been produced unsustainably as long as the consumers want that product, which is a huge problem. Moving on, some of the big industry players like Nestle, they've been in the spotlight for buying palm oil that has been unsustainably produced. Rainforests are cut down to pave way for the palm oil plantations, for instance, in Indonesia, and Nestle has been at the heart of this. I was really keen to hear how Nestle is working on reversing this, having been suspended from the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil in 2008. Coca-Cola as well, it has been in the spotlight for the depletion of local water resources. It was therefore contradictory for me for Coca-Cola to state that they're supporting 5 million women farmers by 2020, yet they're depleting the very resource that is key in the sustainable production of food. This is water. I found that very contradictory. I could go on and on some of my expectations from the big industry leaders, but I would wish to stop at this point and invite Gonzalo, who was part of that session. Gonzalo, would you please share with us your thoughts from that session yesterday?
Well, thank you so much, Nasiki, and again, thank you, Kaya, for setting not only this session, but all of the continuous session with the youth. I can speak like 2 days in a row about the many topics related to agriculture and food production. And let me be totally transparent, honest with you, Nasike. I share many of your concerns, doubts, and frustrations. And at the same time, I carry quite a strong sense of hope on things that are changing. And I'm not trying to be naive here. I know that many times we are confronting the systems that carry contradictions on its own. So when we think about the food and agri system, that means on one side, of course, solving hunger, right? That it's in the front. Then we need to regenerate that biodiversity. We need to increase the health of soil. We need to improve nutrition parameters, use less water, preserve cultural assets, reduce food waste, and solve the climate crisis. And all of that varies from region to region in terms of what's the priority. I'm just acknowledging that it's extremely complex, and I would say acknowledging another element that is connected to the energy sector. I believe, I don't know if we've lost Sayike or Nasike. Can you hear me? I can't see her.
Yes, I can. Hello.
Okay. Sorry, I can see you. There you are. So yeah. So as I was saying, Nasiki, in the food sector, I believe we have a similar brutal mistake as we have made with the energy sector. we use taxpayers' money to subsidize the technology that harm the environment, and then need the money of the taxpayers again to solve the health problem that we created with the damage. So I mean, I think that we are walking that path to do both. We need to solve the mistake that is in the design on how, let's say, the system tried to solve the hunger initially, but we have to go back to do it in a much better way that will allow us to increase not only the capacity of reaching the nutritious part of it, and at the same time recover and regenerate the biodiversity. That also shows us another potential problem, because it's like when we're trying to flatten the curve of the COVID pandemic, but at the same time, through flattening it, we're using so many face masks and protection elements that we're creating another curve on plastic pollution. The food system had a focus on many times, for example, making food last longer, and that has meant a lot of chemical and complex plastics that are now harming the environment. So we have to walk that back, and I have to just acknowledge, for my first 10 years working I was running as a CEO food companies, and that's part of my background. I'm not only a farmer myself, but also run companies like the ones we spoke to, and I understand what are the type of difficulties that are confronting. And when analyzing that, let me go back to the point that I see hope. I see many of what they're saying, I would say, is quite strong in terms of acknowledging the depth of the problem and really going towards the type of solution that might be scalable. For many years, most of the solutions were, I would say, slight CSR projects that were not capable of not even scaling, but far from trying to be somehow the solution of the main problem. But then I see another trend that is fascinating. When you say Tesco saying you cannot force the consumers, I agree with you. Brutal mistake. I mean, it's not about forcing the consumers. If we're willing to solve the complex problems of the world, we cannot wait for the demand from the consumers to solve it. I mean, we cannot wait for 8 billion people to understand all of this complexity in order to ask for the right product. The producers know very well how to improve every aspect of the quality of what they are sending to the market. So we have to see both. I understand that we have to, I mean, we, and I said from Nigel and myself, we're working with the business sector for them to improve the supply, and at the same time connected to what are the changes in the consumer behavior that are helping this to accelerate. In this particular case, let me just mention that veganism is the most rapid change in nutrition habit humans have ever faced. And in that sense, I will see, and I think that, I think that probably that trend connected also to urban high technology farming and somehow lab food will also play a relevant role on reducing all of the pressures that we have created in the environment, and hopefully will release part of the tension and allow us to regenerate that part of nature and soil. I mean, I see, and as I said, I acknowledge many of the aspects that you're mentioning when you're speaking about stewardship. Sure, that one of the topics that brought to me and highlighted to me the dialogues was about those young farmers and entrepreneurs that definitely will play a key role, whether on farming insects to produce ice cream, as we saw, or cattle farming in diverse ecological rich landscapes. as we spoke yesterday, we need to make that attractive for young people, not only to remain. We need to move a lot of our talent, capacity, technologies to the farms in order to make that let's say workforce, that entrepreneur spirit, to make it one that is purpose driven. And I don't know how much more time do I have, Kaya, because I can continue, as I said, 2 days in a row, but
your energy and Nigel's energy really makes me feel that we selected our champions right. So I'm gonna save it because we have 2 more sessions to bring in your comments on. And thank you so much for, I mean, both of you. Like,
if I Kaya, then I wanted to refer something to water. Just
because I just want to say, because I really think it's important that we when we disagree, it's quite important to then be clear about the basis of disagreement. Because Claire, I think I heard you suggest that moving towards a plant-based diet wouldn't help. But I think that so I posted a couple of reports, the Eat Lancet report. That the issue is that we use vast tracts of land to grow vegetables to feed the animals that are reared intensively. So so actually, by moving away from a meat-based diet to a vegetable-based diet, we can massively reduce the pressure on the land and massively reduce the pressure on water. And in fact, it's interesting, of course, that doesn't affect palm oil, but it does affect soy, because soy is used primarily as a feedstock for pigs and cattle, right? So our addiction to pork and beef intensively farmed is indirectly driving Amazon deforestation. So I think, and I've posted a couple of reports. I think it's important. So when you were saying that, I was thinking, I don't agree with you that moving from meat to plant doesn't reduce the land, because I think scientifically it's very clear that it does. The nuance is always important, right? Because we had, I forget his name, the wonderful cattle farmer from the Paraná Delta, that you can have sustainably farmed beef, right? The problem is intensively farmed beef, which is just kind of ripping all the nutrients and all the water out of the land. So just wanted to just make sure. I think there's something that as we get deeper into some of these dialogues, Kai, we have to find ways to share the sources of our insights so that we can disagree more intelligently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one other thing to pick up on there is actually like, you know, I don't think Coca-Cola is already there, but B from Coca-Cola had wanted to talk more about their water targets that they have met in the past 5 years. And I had sort of teed up a question to say, well, it's great that you've actually proven you were able to set a target on water and meet it. How are you going to do that on carbon? So that's the next frontier for Coca-Cola. But I think, you know, I think that the youth dialogues like brought out that nuance, and I think shifting to a plant-based diet, but making sure that, you know, as we develop these new solutions, we're not repeating our mistakes, is I think goes to the youth, a lot of the youth commentary. So what I have to do next is bring us into our next session, which we have 10 minutes for. So this is where youth will provide feedback on the UN Climate Task Force. And we have such a treat today. We have Nisreen Elsaim, who is chairperson of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, to share feedback that she heard at the Italian YCS Summit on the 18th of November, and to summarize some key points that she would be taking back for the UN Climate Task Force, Secretary General's Climate Task Force. So thank you so much for being here. Really, really great to have you.
Thank you very much, Kaya, and thank you for the organizers for having me here today. Allow me first to reflect on something you earlier mentioned, which is what Eva just said to you about being not a good public speaker. Instead, she's just an engineer. And I guess, well, this is one of the issues we are facing in the current world these days, where academicians and scientists stay away from public speeches and from politicians and from decision makers and from policy makers. It's actually, this is almost the story of my life. I started with a very much scientific background, which is physics, but then I decided to come more open and work with other people, organizations, decision makers, politicians, and talk about climate change and how climate change is affecting our life. So I think we can really reach a better world by having a synchronized, a coherent inputs from everyone, scientists, academician, engineer, anything, the technicians, anyone in this decision-making processes, not only the decision makers and not only the politicians that we actually vote for. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Nisreen Elsaim. I'm from Sudan. As you said, I'm the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. First of all, to give you a small introduction about the Youth Advisory Group, it's a group formed by the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, to amplify the voice of the young people, and also as a kind of a recognition of the young people's effort when it comes to climate action and climate movement. Also, our main mandate is to be the bridge between young people and the SG, and also between the SG and young people. It's also very necessary to highlight that we will be the frank eye of the Secretary General on different events we attend, and different momentum happening in different forums around the world. Well, one of the most important things about our advisory group is we come from different backgrounds. We represent different regions. We also have different interests. For example, we have Vlad from Moldova, he's the economist of the group. We have Paloma from Brazil, and she's the lawyer and representing also Latin America. We have Archana from India. She is an indigenous community leader, and also she is a researcher. So there is a lot of diversity in the group when it comes to background and when it comes to interest also. So my role, I guess, as a chair is to coordinate somehow between different bodies and youth advisory group, also to reflect back to the Secretary General on different events like this one, and also to present the youth advisory group on the high level advisory group, and so on. Well, I come from a country where climate change is not the only issue, but it's actually, when we look very carefully, we find that climate change is the root cause for most of our problems. Although we have a low population comparing to the land we have, yet we are suffering from a massive deforestation. Also, desertification is moving very fast in our country. We have more than 36% of our people under the poverty line. We are, of course, the least developed countries. As I said, or actually as Shivi said earlier, more than 5 million kids are out of schools in Sudan, and not mentioning the malnutrition issues, not mentioning the civil war that we had for 40 years, and the conflict over natural resources we had for 20 years. And the main driver and trigger for most of these events is actually climate change. A few weeks ago, we had a very much devastating floods, the worst in 100 years. More than 8,000 were actually homeless, still unfortunately homeless. We had to delay the school season for 3 months, and we lost more than 150 persons, unfortunately. Hundreds of millions were lost in assets, crops, cash crops, farms, and so on. And this is only one of the climate crises that we are witnessing here, not mentioning the health impacts of climate change. Well, I'm an eyewitness of what climate change can do, and that's why I feel that whatever promises we got from the decision makers, from the private sectors, from the governments, if we didn't see actions, and if we didn't actually move at the right time and with the right speed, then we will be in a huge trouble. At least now with the corona, if you stayed indoor and you used your face mask and you used your sanitizer, then the percentage of getting a corona gets lower. But with climate crisis, no one nowhere is safe from what will happen. Well, yesterday, actually 2 days ago, we had our first youth consultation as a youth advisory group on climate change. We had many participants from different regions of the world, and we had a session on net zero or access to net zero. most of the participants divided actually the discussion into 3 areas. Number 1, the government's obligations to push the public sector, but also the private sector to reach net zero. Also, the role of civil society in keeping tracking for what's happening right now for all of us, and what is the obligations by the countries and different organizations and private sector, and also the role of private sector of being innovative and not thinking outside the box, but actually forgetting that there's a box in the first place. Yes, well, also yesterday we had an event for Connect for Climate, Youth Connect for Climate, and it was also about raising the ambitions. This event was a really eye-opening because we heard from a lot of audience, and also we heard from civil society, and we also heard from private sector. They all have commitments, but then how to reach these commitments is the actual question we need to answer. Well, I will take the outcomes of these consultations to the Secretary General, of course, and it will be my honor. But the actual and real question is, what's next? How are we going to hold the different stakeholders, governments, private sector, and so on into account? And I remember that the elected president of the U.S., Joe Biden, said that the new administrative of the U.S. and new government will go back to Paris Agreement in 77 days. Well, I guess this is a very good commitment, because now we can count the days until U.S. is back to the Paris Agreement. So what can we count out of the consultations you got, and how are we going to hold different stakeholders into account is a very much big question. One of the main issues I wanted to highlight, and it makes this consultation very much special, is it's not only thing to have a young person as a trend. Like, we have young person, we heard the voices of youth, and then to tick the box of having young person there, but it's actually driven and designed and implemented by the young people. So it takes us into a total different level of implementation of youth engagement within the different segments. Our role haven't ended yet. We should carry the momentum until Glasgow in COP26, and I'm sure that we will at the end reach what we want if we keep demanding our rights. And yeah, thank you very much for that. One last point, I'm very huge fan of the climate champions for this year and previous years also. We have now youth advisory group, or we have youth consultations, and UK have a youth advisory also for COP26. But I think it's high time also to have a youth climate champion for one of the COPs. Thank you very much.
Nisreen, thank you, and I hope you're stepping up as a candidate for that role, because your work is I love when we first talked and you said, don't thank me, like, this is what we all have to do. So we have a few minutes for our closing remarks, and I have a couple of questions for our high-level champions. First, I think we need a more internally aligned champion strategy in which we are lining up our KPIs, the companies and subnational commitments that we're going after, and then we're all reporting back on who's responsible for what. And I want our youth to come and help take on a few of those commitments and help carry those forward. So how do you guys feel about that? Can we do that?
Well, and thanks for that, Kaya, because that reminds me to a question that Nasike brought on and I didn't answer. So when it comes to accountability, we're absolutely aware of that. I mean, we cannot sustain the credibility of Race to Zero of any of our work without the rigorosity that the crisis requires. And in that sense, just for everybody to know what it means to be part of Race to Zero, that requires first a type of pledge that is validated by a group of researchers and scientists from different parts of the world, led by the Oxford University that you know very well, Kaya. So we're in their house, and they have set quite a strong mechanism when it comes to businesses that has to go through science-based targets. It's not just somebody claims of doing something good. it's science-based target, what defines what is good and what is not. And this group of scientists is helping us to raise the bar and set the right parameters. The second step is to plan in a correct way. The third one is proceed, and the third one is publish. So the 4 Ps: pledge, plan, proceed, and publish. And we are very aware of us needing to be guardians of that credibility. So count on us and challenge us, because that's in the center of the power of this not only campaign, but this initiative that should carry all of these non-state actors to be able to contribute to the parties for them to increase their ambition through the ambition loop.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. And I was so pleased to see that criteria come together. I was on the team that worked on that. I think my question also is, so we have the criteria, we have the system, we have accountability, but how can we go out there and, we've at Oxford have been looking at the 2000 Forbes top 2000 companies, and there's a devastatingly low number of them that have these minimum criteria for their net zero targets, let alone net zero targets. So how can we divvy up that list together? Do you think that we could, how are you reflecting on these dialogues and then going forward into the next year? And, Nigel, feel free to chip in as well.
Yeah, well, let me say something about how we turn the dialogues into action, because this is the heart of it. And so, we've been working really hard over the last 6 months with the team to look sector by sector in a systemic way, like who are all the major players, what are the levers, civil society, investors, cities, trade unions, trade bodies, some of them positive, some of them negative, right? So we're publishing right now these pathways, and then the next 12 months to Glasgow is going to be all around getting institutional support and company and city support for each of these pathways. And actually you start to break it down. So I think we've got 22 sectors, and you can say who are the top 20 to 50 companies, who are the main cities, who are the main countries. So I think a lot of that is shareable. I mean, it's public knowledge. So we maybe need to, Gonzalo and I have thrown a team together 6 months ago, and we've been working flat out to publish these. But now we've got another year, we'll be much more in campaigning mode. So I think if there's a way to, through you, Kaya, and Nisreen and others, to say, look, here's the sectors we're aiming at, here's the companies who have committed, here's the ones who haven't. You can engage with them by whatever means. You can write letters to them, you can camp on their doorstep. But there are leaders and there are a lot of laggards, and what we're trying to do is get to Glasgow with a sense that we've reached a critical mass in each of these sectors. So that Gonzalo and I sometimes say we want this to be the FOMO COP, the fear of missing out, where if you're not a leader, you're starting to realize that the world's moving on and you need to join quickly. So yeah, we can definitely follow up and get sector by sector specific on who needs to step up.
Thank you so much. That's very exciting to hear. I'm so thrilled to be a part of it. I hope our whole audience wants to jump in. We'll be in touch about how they can. And I want to give you both just our last couple of moments to close, since these are the youth dialogues. What role specifically do you see youth playing in this campaign? How can we help? How will you empower us? What's next for youth in the race to zero?
Should I start? Okay.
Yeah, Gonzalo, go for it.
So I think that it's so much about a balance between you are challenging us, and at the same time, and that's not only fantastic, that is needed, but at the same time, we need to build trust, right? And we need to build trust. And in order to build trust, I learned in my life that there are 5 main elements that allow us to build trust. The first one is the history of results. It's hard to trust on someone that hasn't done what it's promising ever. Right? And hopefully, not only Nigel, me, but the whole group of the champions team and what we represent in terms of the market partnership, this effort of different entities participating in Race to Zero, they are carrying a history of results. And we need that to be clear and accountable. Second is the competence. Like, yeah, this history of results, and these people are really competent in terms of helping solve the crisis. The third one is the intentions. And sure, we might sometimes doubt of the intentions, but until we have certainty of what are the wrong intentions, let's try to trust on the right intentions of the people that are joining until we have we got clarified. The fourth one is congruence, and I tend to think that we have shown through the Race to Zero that it's quite a long part of congruence, but I would say the history of results, the competence, the intentions, the congruence are some things that in which please challenge us and help us make it properly. The fifth element to build trust is about the account in favor in the emotional bank. And in that sense, I believe that these dialogues and the way that you've said it, Kaya, and the whole team are so important to increase the account of in favor of in the emotional bank between all of the different stakeholders that we have to sit in the same room in order to move forward. But I would love for those elements to be embedded into the way the youth is challenging us.
Thanks. And Nigel?
First of all, I love working with Gonzalo. I'm always learning. I've got that list of 5.
Likewise, my brother.
But look, I want to say a few words and I want to make an announcement. First, I want to thank Shivi and Kaya and our partners at Oxford and Resilient 40 for creating this amazing, innovative dialogue. It's, when we talked about dialogue, of course, we had a few ideas, but it's wonderful what you've done here, and this has been really, really enriching for everybody. And thanks for all of our great speakers and for the courage and the clarity that they brought to the conversations. Youth leaders from all over the world and the industry leaders who've had the courage and the trust to step into those conversations. We've been really inspired by those. One of my biggest takeaways is that one of the most inspiring things is to move away from the idea of young people as just activists, right? To see a much more multifaceted idea for me emerging of young people as entrepreneurs, practitioners, scientists, farmers, communications experts, policymakers. I think we need a much more diverse and rich idea of what young or the youth means, and these dialogues really help expand that as so often. And I love what the Secretary General said recently at the Italian Youth for Climate Summit, where he said, "Where youth march, the world follows." And one of the things I really want to avoid, sometimes it feels like there's a polarization being set up between young people and old people. So maybe I'm an old person and you're young, and I think we have to avoid that. I like to think that really what we need to form is a coalition which fights for all the unborn generations to come, because the gap between the young and the old on these panels is tiny in the scale of history and geological time. We really need to come together. We can't afford to fight. And that's why I'm so excited today that Gonzalo and I are launching the Race to Zero Youth Fellowship Program. This is a fellowship led by the high-level champions team, but inspired by you guys, our partners. And it's going to create a space for a small number of young professionals to work with the champions team and to contribute directly to the work on our agenda of driving ambitious climate action. So if you're an early career professional under 30, we highly encourage you to apply. You'll find all the information on the Race to Zero website, and we'll post it on social media. And we're really excited to find a small group of really talented young people to work with us, to hold us to account, to help drive us forward, and to take a step forward in their own leadership journey. These dialogues, I'm convinced, are just the start of a conversation. And as Nisreen noted, action in the sprint to Glasgow. We're really looking forward to working with Oxford Net Zero Resilient 40, the UNSG's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, and all of the rest of you to build on what we've achieved, the trust that we're building, the positive contributions to the emotional bank. As Gonzalo said, I really want us to follow up with more specific dialogues with broader participants. You mentioned, Kai, as policymakers. If policymakers are being blamed as the reason why we can't move, let's get one in and hear from them. And to broader participation on other activities like the campaigns to reach tipping points next year, in the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience. So with that, Kai, thank you so much for everybody, and I'll draw it to an end.
Thank you. I think that gives us all something to celebrate into the weekend. And thank you for an incredible couple of 2 weeks. You've all really been champions, true to the name. Thanks to all.
Thanks so much.